Oh, now's the time.
We're on.
Fine,
We're
I
back.
agree with you, but marijuana's not a narcotic. That's all.
Right.
Marijuana is not a narcotic, Jeff Frazier says. Why is that?
Marijuana is not
Because
a narcotic.
the Public Health Code defines it as not being marijuana. It's opioids. Opioids and cocaine are defined as, well, opioids are defined as narcotics.
You got a
And
case source for that?
Yeah, well, Public Health Code.
And?
7.117.
What about Sinclair's and Sinclair?
And Sinclair case, yes. Not only is it not a narcotic, it is unconstitutional under Michigan law to treat marijuana like a narcotic or other Schedule I hard drugs. People versus John Sinclair, Michigan Supreme Court, 1972.
I know.
Love the
What up now?
Code
citation.
333.
We got 30 minutes.
7117.
I know Josh is lobbying for talking about Monsanto being bought out by Bayer. I think that's one thing we talk about.
Let's not do that.
All right. We can talk about the Rocky Mountain high-intensity drug
John
trafficking
Denver.
area.
No.
Or the new one that they just put together in Port Huron.
That's true. It's, I mean, it's. I could give a little perspective on this. I mean, as this continues to go on, we're talking about legalization being on the ballot, and we're talking about licensing for the state of Michigan as the state of Michigan gets into the business of selling marijuana. There's still criminal prosecutions that are taking place. And I don't know who in the right mind would want to take a conviction for a marijuana case when, a few years maybe, even if it's not, even though we all believe that it is going to be, shortly thereafter, or even just the attitude that exists in the misplacement of marijuana being a controlled substance or a contraband still. It's ludicrous. Absolutely ludicrous. And I'll give you an example. I was trying to figure a way to kind of articulate this, but in light of the issues that we're going to be arguing about tomorrow, one of which is this usable marijuana. You've heard this before, this 2.5 ounces of usable marijuana. There was this case, I don't know if you heard about Carruthers. Just kidding.
I've never heard of that case.
Just kidding. But poster child, our good friend Earl. Anyways, the one of the ongoing gotchas that has always been is the wet marijuana, not usable marijuana that was moldy, marijuana that was wet, that was attached to stalks, that was seeds, hermaphroditic, whatever. It was all deemed usable, stuffed in a bag, weighed. That's your case. I could tell you the number of cases we had early on where someone they had 12 plants. We closed our facility. Total compliance. They cut 2 of them down. The day ended with them being outside of compliance and having, 8 pounds of marijuana or something like that.
Those are the great cases that you hear about in the media where they're talking, this person just got caught with 30 pounds of marijuana, and it turns out that it's, 6 wet plants. Like, give me a break.
Right. And this has been a...
Street value of...
Yeah, right. It's been an unequivocal gotcha moment. I could tell you, I got a list of... When I would give advice to people that were looking for how to stay in compliance with the MMA, I would tell them only of the mistakes of others, or what were perceived as mistakes of noncompliance. And it was always looming around this idea that if you're trying to stay in compliance, these are the things that they'll come at you. These are the gotcha moments. One is this, usable versus unusable. And I remember, I've speak of this often, the Judiciary Committee was taking testimony at some point, and one of the committee members asked the state police, what's your definition of usable marijuana in light of the Medical Marijuana Act's definition, because the state police should have their own or whatever. And they didn't have one. And what happened is, by not having one, it left ambiguities in how the law was going to be applied. And ambiguities favored the police. Ambiguities made it so that there was an argument that was being made, and it wasn't unambiguous compliance, which was been...
They could arrest and let the courts figure it out.
There you go. And, of course, this begs the question of what happened to the arrest from... What happens to the immunity from arrest, we should say. Not just the immunity from prosecution, which is deemed and determined once you've been arrested and gone through the system. But what about that moment when you're encountering the law enforcement officer? How do they get to decide that your immunity, that you rely on the card?
There's no reason for them to decide.
But they do.
But no, they don't. They always decide one way, right? There's
right.
no penalty for them to just throw you in jail. And as Chad said, just let the court deal with it. It's not their
Right,
problem.
but my point is, I guess, just it doesn't get me anywhere. But what we know is that you had to defend, or to claim your immunity in court when you get to court. But what is there to be said about the immunity before you're arrested? And the police just take it without any kind of due process. They're just going to say, nope, that's 2.6, or
That's right.
that dead plank counts.
Sorry, that cooler you had it in.
But in all-
puts the weight over 5 ounces.
Right,
so.
because it's still frozen.
Right.
And in the summer, it'll weigh a lot less, but we're not weighing it then. But the point of it in this context of this gotcha moment and this usable marijuana, it's amazing. Some might say it's karma. I don't know. Give it whatever you want. But, then and the whole patient community is like, in caregiver, this is crazy. How can we call this drying plants usable? How can that weight be counted against anybody? If someone is growing outside, which is defined within the law and allowed, and they're going to harvest in and around the same time, they got a lot of wet marijuana that they're going to maybe want to keep wet, kind of, nurture over the year so, it can be used properly, and, curing and drying for usable, certain amounts, and being able to control that. But nevertheless, it has been challenging, and labeling future use dates and things like this and whatever. So it's been the struggle. But all of a sudden, like in the drop of a pen to a paper and a signature of majority voted a Court of Appeals case of manual, all of this all of a sudden changes. All of a sudden, the plain reading of the language of dried becomes reality. All of a sudden, the weights and the protocols for developing the weights, for taking evidence, for the weight is that you're going to be defending, is done the evidence intake. They'll label it any way they want to. There's nobody there watching if they're weighing it with the bag and the jars, whether it's dried, whether they're leaving it out or not. But they just put a number on it, get a police report, and that's how it rolls. That's the way it's always been. That's the way it's always been. Always been.
Catch me if you can.
They are going, and the discrepancies in the weight, they don't care. If they tell you it's one or the other, they make an extra, couple ounces each weighing of whatever the material is. They're not going to just add it to the culpability. And then all of a sudden, you get a case that identifies that the issue of whether it was dried at the time that it was confiscated is of real concern. And all of a sudden, this protocol that is going on, that's been the forever protocol of weighing marijuana, all of a sudden is under extreme scrutiny, to the point where the decree that they use, the more unfair, the more thumb they put on the scale, the more they weigh without disclosing the packaging that's associated with the number, all works against them. Comes back to bite them, and they're losing because of it. And it's interesting because what changed? What changed? The actual weight of the material, the dried, it is what it is. That's the dried material. That's what the law says. But this case happens, and the exposure to just the abuse and carnage that's caused by this protocol of the, ambiguous drying marijuana versus reading the law for what it is and giving it the benefit of the doubt so that people have a chance to comply with the law by letting marijuana dry. All of it's exposed for the facade that it was. You think of all the people that have been taken down for that, all the people that didn't know what to do with leaves that they were going to throw it away. It's sitting in a bag somewhere. They don't want to. They don't know where to throw it. You ask the police officer, "How do I throw out my marijuana? Where do I throw it?" They won't tell you.
They'll come help you.
Not
Where you
where we
don't-
can find it.
Where you don't put it.
a big bag of it.
Where you don't put it is in
Yeah,
your
just call us.
garbage. Where you don't put it in your garbage, because once you put it in your garbage, it's no longer private, and the police can come along and take it. Some have suggested that you chop it up and spread it all over the neighborhood, so if they ever bring the police dogs out, they're distracted from the main source. But
Oh, that's good to know.
but really, but what I'm saying is, all of a sudden, in one signing of a document, all of a sudden, the shenanigans that have driven all this forfeiture proceeds, all this, nonsense of just unrealistic interpretations that were just forwarded and continued and, ignorantly looked away from any rational, comprehensive way to give people some notice, give people some direction, some kind of guidance. Instead, it was, no, but just, you can't, it's impossible. I mean, literally viewing this in a way, in an interpretation that made caregiving impossible.
Yeah, the law is just so poorly written.
And therefore you are a felon now.
Yeah.
So I say it's just, but what is happening now, and as we get ready for some of these hearings coming up, new life driven into Section 4 immunity, in the sense that there's real meaning now to 2.5 ounces of usable marijuana. And I say that because, just on a side note, I want to get into some of these other things with the time we've left. It's always been, I know from a legal perspective, I thought it's fascinating to see how the court would work this issue out. You have, I learned long ago that you can't expect the courts to read the law the same way I do, even though, it's hard to, reading it just objectively. But instead, because of the, antagonism to the Michigan Medical Marijuana Act, it seemed as if you had to kind of think of the worst, most twisted type of interpretation and expect that, or whatever the obscure or extreme interpretation is being offered by the state is somehow going to be adopted by some court of appeals somewhere. And we've seen that be a political ping pong ball bouncing back and forth of the way that patients have been. They don't get the benefit of the real notice of their cases. The case that lets them know that they were right or wrong. It's I don't get a choice before, and where there's, and manipulation by the law enforcement community in every sense to try to not be fair and, trying to implement the Michigan Medical Marijuana Act. But it's been distressful. It's been we've seen the carnage all over the place. But it's just amazing the way that it just changes. And we're kind of in that same phase to a certain degree, like, with just the on the horizon of the legalization and different ways that it's being looked at, but still it remains where we are. And as I say this issue about the Manuel case and how usable marijuana is being defined, there's still people that are being arrested and waits are over and no one's contemplating whether it's wet or not, and some law enforcement communities are drying it out and themselves and whatnot. But what I wanted to get back to was that the way that they resolved this issue of the usable marijuana was kind of not what, it's what I thought it should be, but it was surprising that by declaring that it's not usable marijuana, or it's unusable because it's wet, its place is that it doesn't exist. It's not, you don't have to explain for when it becomes usable. It's just not usable, and therefore it's invisible, which I think everybody within the medical cannabis community and beyond wanted to interpret that way because it's caregiver.
It's what the act says.
It's what the act says.
And
the court affirmed that, which I thought was a great, the right thing to do. And of course, the antagonistic argument that made by prosecutors now is, well, what if someone's driving around with 1,000 plants that are soaking wet, just recently harvested, and it's way more than they have? You're saying because they're wet, that none of it counts, it's all invisible?
Right. That's exactly what they said.
And that's what made it. I had one prosecutor argue that, Judge, how do we know that they have all this and they just keep spraying it with water bottles to keep it wet or something?
Yeah, because that makes sense.
All right, that was my rant. I'm glad you guys let me.
That was a good rant. We've got to take a quick break.
We do? I don't know. All right, fine.
And then we're going to come back.
Fine.
We're going to go a little late tonight.
I don't know about that. But
couple minutes.
what?
We'll be right back.